Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30, the parable of the talents. For it is as if a man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them, and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter the joy of your master." And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Then the one who had received 1 talent also came forward, saying, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master replied, "You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to the one with 10 talents. For all those who have more will be given, and they will have abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth."
May I speak in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. The parable of the talents is a tricky one. At surface level, it can seem to be supporting capitalism, making a good investment and return on your money. But I'd like to throw that kind of interpretation out right from the start, because it makes absolutely no sense in the context of Jesus's teaching and the way that he lived his life, reaching out to the marginalised and warning strongly against the dangers of worshipping money and wealth and having those as your goal in life. Quite the opposite. I'd say that this parable is about abundant and generous giving and about trust. Abundant giving first. The amounts that the master gave in the story were absolutely huge. The notes in my study Bible point out that 1 talent was worth more than 15 years' wages as a labourer. So even for the servant who got 1 talent, it was a really substantial amount. And then there was a generous amount of freedom and trust given too. The master went off, and he went for a long time. He didn't micromanage or even oversee what was going on. He completely entrusted his servants with his affairs. And it's trustworthiness that he commends the first 2 servants for when he returns. He says, "Well done, good and trustworthy servants." And because they've been trustworthy, he says that they will be given charge of many things. So for these 2 servants, the story plays out a bit like this. They've received the blessings from the master. They've gone off straight away to put them to good use. They've applied their full abilities, and they've remained faithful to him even though he was gone for a long time. And that shows a real trust on their behalf, a belief that he would come back. They anticipated his return. They didn't go off and spend the money as their own. And it seems that on his return, they then offer it all back to him. There's no mention of them sort of expecting a cut for themselves. Instead, they recognise that it was a gift, that it all belongs to him, even though they have applied their own efforts to it. And so in their story, there is a sense of living in abundance, with a fullness of life, purposefully engaged in the master's business. Enter into my joy, he says. And one commentator I read pointed out that in many ways they had already entered into that joy, or at least begun to. It wasn't that the master was saying, okay, you've done all the hard work, now you can put your feet up and enter into my joy. No, they were going to be put in charge of more things. The work continued. It was an ongoing choice that they had made. They'd already entered into the kingdom of the master. They were living life his way, doing things his way. But what of the third servant? It does all seem rather harsh what happened to him, thrown out into the darkness. But perhaps we can see this as something of a self-condemnation through the choices that he made. He didn't accept the gift or the opportunity he was offered. He just hid them away. He didn't join in the master's business in any way. Why? Well, because he didn't trust the master. He said he was afraid. He perceived that the master was harsh, and that then was the response that he got. There is a truth in life that what you go looking for is sometimes, or more likely, what you're going to find, or at least perceive. Perhaps that's why the Bible in so many places urges us to keep our focus on what is good and true and honest and life-giving, to keep our eyes open to God being at work, even through the times of darkness, or when it feels like he's gone for a long time. Our first reading from Thessalonians encouraged the Christians there who were under persecution to remember that they were, and we are, children of the light, not the darkness. We shouldn't sleep our lives away or throw it away in drink. Instead, the author urges, clothe yourselves with faith and hope and love, and keep going. Keep focused on Jesus and the salvation that he offers, and encourage one another. Build each other up. Encourage is such a lovely word, bringing to life courage, strength of heart within one another. Living in faith and in trust inevitably involves risk. There is a saying that faith is spelt R-I-S-K. And to persevere in faith, particularly in times of hardship and uncertainty, takes courage. Courage to take the next step when God reveals it, even though we may not know the next one after that. And courage sometimes to wait on God. You may remember the story of the Israelites being led by the pillar of fire and cloud through the wilderness. But it wasn't always on the move. Sometimes that pillar stayed still, and there were days and nights when they stayed in camp until it was time to move on. Now, in terms of our church and our vision, I have a sense that we are in a waiting time. And in some ways, it feels a bit like a brokenness also. I find waiting times uncomfortable. But there are also times when God is powerfully at work, shaping us and preparing us for next steps. And our job then is to wait and to keep praying so that we're ready and we recognise and we're ready to respond when those next steps come. Years ago, I remember mulling over with an older church member what direction my life was taking and whether or not I was on the right path. And she said to me, quite sharply I remember, well, unless God's given you a different sign, just keep going in the same direction. When you're on a long journey down the motorway, she said, you don't turn off suddenly at the next junction unless there's been a sign to indicate that's the way that you should go. You just keep going until you see that sign. So for now, just keep going faithfully with what God has given you for now until he tells you differently. And I think maybe that applies to us and our vision statement. Our circumstances may have changed this last year, but the direction of travel remains firmly the same. Let me remind you of that statement again. St Mary's should be a community of deep faith that is relevant and accessible to all and reaches beyond its building. And we also identified 3 priorities to support that. to be an open church, which may include development of the building, connected both within the church and out into the community, and equipped for mission, recognising the 5 T's of mission: to tell the good news, to teach and nurture people in faith, to transform the world, addressing injustice and so on, to tend and care for others in need, and to treasure one another and the natural world that God has made. None of that has changed. And so in the waiting and potential shaping for when the next steps come, and I'm sure that they will, can I encourage you to keep on going, to encourage one another, and most importantly, to encourage one another in prayer, so that together we keep our focus on God and find our strength in Him. I'd like to end with a story. It's entitled Push, which stands for Pray Until Something Happens. One night, a man had a vision from God in which God told him that he had work for him to do. He showed him a large rock that stood in a field near his house and told the man that his job was to push against the rock with all his might. This the man did day after day for many years. Putting his shoulder against the hard stone, he pushed and pushed until he was worn out. The stone never moved, and he began to feel discouraged. Other voices filled his head, telling him he was a failure, that he hadn't heard God right, that God didn't really care. And as the voices grew louder, he called out to God in prayer. God, I have worked long and hard in your service. Day after day I have worked with all my strength, and yet that rock hasn't moved even a millimetre. Why have I failed? What have I done wrong? And God said, why this talk of failure? I never asked you to move the rock, simply to push against it, and this you have done. Now take a look at yourself and how you have grown. You're so much stronger, and your abilities have increased through adversity. You have been faithful, and now that you have turned to me in prayer, I, my friend, will move the rock. When adversity comes, when doubts creep in, when all around seems hopeless and lost, carry on with what God has given you to do in faith and trust, and pray until something happens. Our next song is one to listen to more than to sing. I came across it when we were on holiday back in September, and the words really spoke to me. I hope they might be helpful to some of you too.